Hey there, everyone. Simon Walker here. I'm just going to show my screen. So welcome again to another one of these webinars. Thank you for rejoining us. And we have the wonderful Chad Perkins on the line. Hey, Chad.
Hey, how you doing?
Great stuff. So we have some exciting things to run through today. Let me get up the list of what we're doing. Here we are. And so today we're going to be looking at the first of 3 sessions that Chad's doing about integrating Cinema 4D and Trapcode tools. And it's a kind of investigation or a window into your investigations, I would say, Chad, because this is a lot to do with how you approach a creative task, especially when you're discovering tools as well.
Yeah.
There we
Sorry,
go.
that was very helpful. Yes.
Excellent. And this is a theme that we've been investigating in recent weeks. If you've joined us previously, thank you for coming back. We are trying to talk about things that you can work with the Red Giant toolset and the Maxon toolset. And officially, I'm Simon Walker. I'm Director of Training at Maxon. And we have a desire to help you work out techniques how you can do this with existing shipping versions, and also giving you a little information about what might be coming down the line in terms of features that can officially help you work with both tools together. And I think there's a little bit more of that as we go on, perhaps tomorrow. Spoiler alert, Cineware will be working in Trapcode soon. So that's really the tease. But just a couple of things before we get started. If you want to sign up for any of these webinars, I'll put the link to the PDF download inside the chat box. We are recording this session and you'll automatically get the link to it at the end of the webinar in about an hour's time after the webinar ends. And also these links, the registration links, act as links to the recordings. So if at any point you want to look at a previous one, then you can just click on that link, that text, or whenever it's set to be run, and then you can have access to the recording. And also, since we're sharing, we have a whole other series of weekly webinars covering related topics, but in a slightly different way. And these are every Monday at 9 a.m. Pacific or midday Eastern time. And they are accessible from anywhere, so you can access these from all over the globe. And I'll also put the link in for these. These are designed to be a little more informal with lots of different references to resources and project files and that sort of thing. So I'll put links in both of these. And also, just to say that if you're a student, we have a recent update to the program, which means that you can have a student license, and that's complimentary. So I'll put that in the links as well, and all these links will be available at the end of the session. Great. Okay, so let me switch over to you, Chad. Let me make you a presenter. Here we are. So make you presenter so we can see your screen. Here we go. And feel free, everyone, to type in questions into the question box. Some of you have already. Hi, Ryan. Hi, Daniel. Tuning in from Victoria, Canada. And welcome to a sunny Tuesday. Thanks, Daniel. Yes, it's sunny here in Portland in Oregon as well. And Chad, you're up in Seattle, aren't you?
Yes, sir. And it's like
Fantastic.
I haven't been outside today because I'm doing these things, but you know, it's fairly bright out there.
Not raining.
I don't think
It's
so.
on or
No.
off. It's binary in Seattle, isn't it?
Yeah.
To some extent. Hi to Mike from Brisbane. And also, sorry, Mike from Brisbane and Alexander from Suffolk. Excellent. Not too far where I come from. Excellent. Glad to see you. And we've also got Darren helping us out on the questions as we run through. So if you've got any questions, in order not to interrupt Chad too much, then please ask away and we'll add answers where we can and links to resources where we can too. And also, if there does seem to be any slight lag on the visuals, then in the recording, the lag isn't there because the recording happens at the source, on the server. But what we found is if I turn my webcam off, then the lag sometimes gets a bit better. So I'm going to do that now. Obviously, there are more reasons why I should be turning it off, but anyway. So stop sharing my webcam. And hi from Alexander in LA, and Yanra from Orange County. Lovely to see you. Great. Over to you then, Chad.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Welcome, everybody. This has been a really fun thing preparing for this, as we'll talk about as we go through. There are a bunch of things that were kind of janky in my workflow, like I would use them. And this webinar gave me the opportunity to kind of really dig in and figure out what the problems were, troubleshoot. And so I'm hoping, as I pass that info on to you, that maybe there are some things that annoyed you in your workflow that become a little bit easier. So, the whole theme of this stuff this week, all the webinars this week, is that we're trying to take Cinema 4D stuff, integrate it with Red Giant stuff, and we do that through After Effects, of course. And there are a few main ways to do this, 4 ways that I found, and this is going to be the subject of what we're doing. Number 1, we can export the mesh, an OBJ file, and we can use that OBJ file in Trapcode particular, Trapcode form, and Trapcode mirror. Now, if you're not familiar with all of these plugins intimately, then you might not realize what an OBJ file would do in each of these, but they function differently. And that's important to know. And so we're going to be looking at an OBJ file in each one of these plugins to see what they do exactly, so you know when to use them and what for. Also, you can take Cinema 4D files now into After Effects natively using Cineware. We'll be looking at that briefly today, but we'll be digging that more into it in the next couple of days, really getting into the details of all the features and functions and all that kind of stuff. And then also you can export an AEC file from Cinema 4D. We'll look at that not today, but later on this week. This is an old workflow that still has some merit, as we will see. And also you can export splines via Illustrator. I'll show you how to do that and why you'd want to do that. And we're going to be looking at that tomorrow mostly. So this is just kind of like an overview of the whole deal, the whole week of webinar stuff. So if you're not familiar with Cinema 4D, there's a spoiler. I'm just going to close that, dude. And I didn't polish up from the last seminar. Oh my gosh, and this is just ruining everything. Okay, so if you're not familiar with Cinema 4D, we're just going to start from scratch here. I figure that, in my travels in the motion design world, I meet people that are like me and have like no clue what's going on with Cinema 4D, and then I meet people that are like just masters, and it's usually like, there's not very much middle ground. People are usually like wizards, or at least they feel like that to me anyways, compared to what I know. And so like, I'm not a great Cinema 4D pro, but usually when I'm in Cinema 4D, you might want to start by creating like a primitive object. And so if I hold down my mouse on this little thing, we get these primitive shapes. And so we could make like a sphere, for example. And then it shows up in our object manager over here on the right. So this is now an object in our scene. You can think of it almost like a layer in After Effects. And then we have the attributes manager. So we can see the attributes for this thing. And for these parametric objects, they have parameters that control them, which is really cool. So we could increase the segments to increase the amount of geometry there, or we could decrease the segments if we want to. And we could also take down like the radius and some other things. And if we have other shapes, like if I click on this again and go to like a platonic, this creates like an interesting shape. I'm not sure why that's called a platonic object. I've always wondered that. It's a peculiar name. So anyways, it's a very interesting thing. Anyway, so I come over here to the type, and by default, it's like set this Icosa thing, but there's like this buckyball, which is kind of like a soccer ball type thing. And there's these kind of like other shapes, which are kind of interesting. I'm going to go to tetra. Actually, no, I'm going to go to, is it octa? Yeah, octa kind of creates like this cool diamond thing, and you're seeing our sphere kind of cut through it. We're going to use that again in a second. I could turn these off temporarily by going to this check mark and just like clicking it, so it just turns it off. So they're there, they exist still, they're just kind of not being calculated. That's what the little X means. There's some other interesting things here too. There's like this landscape object. And basically what I'm doing here is I want to create something just quick and dirty, just really easy. I'm giving you like a 2-minute introduction into Cinema 4D. And then we're going to take what we're making back into After Effects and into Trapcode stuff. So I'm just giving you just a little intro. By the way, if you are familiar with Cinema 4D, I do have one trick that I figured out that's kind of cool, that seems like kind of an intermediate fun trick. I don't know, maybe people know this, but whether you're new or not, it might help. So I'm just going to make a cube. This is a diversion. This is like a side note. If you have more experience with Cinema 4D, this might help. But when you create an object, by default, it puts the anchor point at the center of the object. And then it puts the anchor point on the floor. So that means the center of the object is on the floor and half of it is underneath the floor. Well, a lot of times I'm making a scene and I want to use the grid as a common floor. I don't want things to center or to scale from their center or just from the center. I want it to adjust from the bottom. I want their bottoms, the butts of my objects to be on this grid. And by default, again, because the anchor point is halfway through, so in this case, the size of the vertical size is 200 centimeters. So then the anchor point is 100 centimeters up. So what I want to do is increase the Y position by half of the size, the vertical size of the object. So in this case, it would be 100 centimeters. So I want to take this, the size, cut it in half, increase the Y position by that amount, and then it puts the butt of the object on the floor like I want. However, if I then go back and increase or decrease the size, then it ruins it. So what I want is a dynamic way to automatically have the position of the object be half of the Y size. And again, I don't know anything about Cinema 4D, but I figured this out because Cinema 4D is like known as the easiest 3D app to learn, and it really is. So I can go to the size Y, right click, and go to expressions, because there's expressions in Cinema 4D, just like After Effects. And I'm going to use this control set driver. So this is going to control our expression. And then I go to the coordinates, and the position Y, I'm going to right click, expressions, and I'm going to set driven. Now, by default, then, it's going to just take this value. So a size of 200 centimeters creates a Y position of 200 centimeters. But that's not what we want. We want to cut this in half. So we have to fiddle with this expression a little bit. By the way, I realize this is kind of like a long little side tour. Nothing else is going to be like super advanced like this, but it's just a fun little trick that I'm almost done with. So just bear with me for 1 second. I'm just going to go over here. When you do that thing, the set driven deal we just did, it creates this Espresso tag, it's called. And so if I double click it, I get the Espresso editor, this environment. And we can see like this visual way of doing things. By the way, this Espresso environment is admittedly extremely complex, and I have no idea what I'm doing in here. So I probably have no business showing this to you, but it's a cool trick that's really easy to do. So I don't have to know Espresso to know how to do this thing. So the size goes into this range mapper, goes out to the position. We don't really need it for this trick, and it's just going to be confusing. So I'm just going to delete the range mapper, and then I could put the size Y directly into the position Y, and there we go. But I need something that's going to cut this in half, this data in half before it gets to the position. So I'm going to right click, create a new node, and I'm going to go to Espresso, calculate, and math. And then all we have to do is go to the function and choose divide. And then I'm going to choose the divide by 2. Divide by 2. So then I take the input, yoink, and the output, yoink. And now we are dividing by 2. Oh, wait, I messed that up because now it's not connecting. So I'll just choose 2. There we go. So now if I close this, I go back to my cube and I go to my size. No matter what size I make my object, I don't have to do some kind of weird thing. I don't have to convert this to an editable object. I don't have to group it into a null. Now, as I adjust the Y scale, the anchor point can do whatever it wants because the butt is on the floor thanks to this cool little Espresso thing. I love that. And for me, that just gives me a lot of sanity when I'm dealing with these objects and I want the butt of them all to be on the floor. So that's helpful. Anyways, I'm going to delete that, go back to my landscape, and
by the way, Chad,
yes.
just thought it'd be useful. Darren recorded about an hour ago a small little tip that I've just shared in the chat about doing that exact thing. And we had a couple of questions earlier on about could we make that into a little handout as a reference thing. So thank you for doing that, Darren. It's about 60 seconds and you can download it from the chat and we'll add it into the notes.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Yeah, this is kind of like a multi-step thing if you're not used to it, but once you get used to doing it, it's super quick and easy. So thanks, Darren, for that awesome tutorial so that can actually be useful. So I have my landscape object here, and I'm just going to fiddle with it like a little bit more. I could increase the Y height and make a landscape. What I want to make is like a cool little ball, like a little particle ball. And so what I could do is go over here and check the spherical option, and then there's that happens. But now I could go in and fiddle with these settings and get them to be kind of like the way I want to here. I can, you know, adjust these, scale this down, and maybe I can increase the sea level and increase the plateau level a little bit. Anyways, a lot of interesting things I could do with this if I want to, the rough furrows and the fine furrows, and some interesting things I could do when playing with this. And then I could also use something very popular in Cinema 4D, the cloner object, and I could pick this little cloner, and then I could click on one of these objects like my platonic and shift click the sphere and drag and drop it into the cloner. And then I can increase, like, it makes a grid of my objects, and I can increase like the size of how big this is or whatever. I think I'm going to change the form from a cubic grid to a sphere, and then I can increase the number of these and the size of these. And then with this selected, I'm going to go and select an effector to adjust these. So I'm going to go and choose the random effector so that these are kind of like all over the place a little bit. And I might want to check scale so that these can be a little bit smaller. Actually, let me check uniform scale there. And then we could adjust the uniform scale, and now they're all different sizes and shapes. So then what we could do is export this. I made a better example earlier, so I'm just going to use that file instead of whatever horrible monstrosity this is. It gets better, folks. Trust me. This is just a quick example. I could go to File, Export, OBJ. Now, an OBJ file is just a still object. So when we bring this into Cinema 4D, we're just going to have a still object. And that presents some limitations for Trapcode stuff, because if we did have animation in this, we'd only be able to export one frame as an OBJ file from Cinema 4D. We could bring in this animated thing as a C4D file, but it's not something that can be used by Trapcode. Simon, you alluded to this earlier, and in the morning group, we kind of skipped over it, but would you like to interject and give us some lowdown, dirty scoop news on what's coming up in the future?
Well, it's possibly more relevant when you've got the particular or the form example up, but absolutely I can do that. More than happy to give the scoop. We you can export OBJs and OBJ sequences, especially if you have the Robite plugin, which I'll give a link for. But the limitation is to do with some of the animations, and also it's just an OBJ sequence. So in coming in a few weeks' time, we'll have the ability to be able to work with Cineware files as objects inside form and particular and mirror. And that's something that our CEO shared at the beginning of C4D Live a couple of weeks ago. And it's one of the things that we're excited about now that the engineering teams from Red Giant and Maxon are talking together.
I love that. That's going to be so exciting. Okay, anyways, let me show you like what we can do with this here. So I'm going to bring in, well, actually, I have the Cinema 4D file that I made that's just kind of like this thing, and it's the actual C4D file, the native C4D file. So I can use this as I would any other clip. You can see that my settings in this are just the default 1280 by 720 at 30 frames per second. That's my Cinema 4D settings carried over here into After Effects. So I can drag this into the new comp icon, make a composition with it, and there it is. There's my object. You can see this not much better than what I just did, but it's there. And I could change the renderer from software to OpenGL, for example, and that gets rid of all my viewport, whatever. And then now we just have the object here natively. So what I really wanted to show is that parametric objects like the landscape object and stuff in cloners, that all comes over just fine with the native C4D stuff, and when exported to OBJs, which is really handy as well. So what I'm going to do is here, I'm going to go to this composition, which has nothing in it really. It's just basically 3 solids. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the OBJ version that I exported. So it's similar to the C4D, except it doesn't have all that stuff. It's just the mesh information. I'm going to drag this to my composition, turn off the visibility. And what I want to show you here is something that's pretty critical that we're going to be digging into throughout this week. And that is what an OBJ file does in each of these plugins. So let's actually start with Mir. So I'm going to go ahead and apply Mir 3. And what Mir does, if I turn off the visibility of the solids on top of it, is that it creates kind of like this cool mesh. It takes like a 3D mesh. By default, it's distorted by this kind of like fractal field, fractal distortion in the background. And we're going to be digging into Mir a lot, because if you want to create 3D objects in After Effects, Mir and Particular and Form are really essential tools. Also, Trapcode DAO, a little shout out to DAO. We're going to be talking about DAO later on this week as well, not today, but tomorrow and the next day as well. So what I want to do here is I open up geometry, and by default, the base geometry is a plane, but I can change this to an OBJ model and click that. If you're not a modeling person, you can click choose OBJ, and there's a library. See the 50 objects. It's actually even more than that, but this comes with a collection of 3D objects, some basic stuff that you can play with here in Mir, and also some, Pixel Lab objects. So like this cassette or the car, gun, whatever. And then if I clicked add new object, I could bring in OBJ files this way. And when I do it this way, it creates this custom library of stuff that I've imported. And then anytime I open up Mir, I could just navigate to this and use the files from my library here as well. For now, I'm just going to click cancel because it's in my comp, so I can go down to the OBJ settings and go down to 3D model and pick my OBJ model there. And there is our object. And I could go ahead and add lights to this. I'm going to add a red light just so you can kind of see what it's doing. And you could see, oops, let me adjust this. Yes, see that? It's lighting that object and creating some magic there, which is pretty cool. I love it. Now, there's a lot we need to do to this to make it look better, and we're not going to take the time to do that right now, but we're going to come back to Mir and make some great stuff in it. So let's show you what it does in particular. I'm going to go to Effect, Trapcode, and Particular. And we'll find that this works very differently. Again, the way that the Particular, Form, and Mir handle OBJ files, it's all very different because they're very different tools. So Particular is a particle generator. It's generating these particles and spitting them out. So the way that we use OBJs in Particular is as an emitter, as the shape of the emitter. So I can go into the emitter and change the emitter type from point. Right now, it's just emanating from one solitary point in space. And I can change this to OBJ model, and then I can go to OBJ emitter. And from here, I can choose the OBJ file. And I don't find myself using this feature often, even though it's a really sexy feature to have and a really cool function. But what happens is that, with particles, they're constantly born. So it's kind of ambiguous what the shape is that's creating this. Sometimes it does come in handy, though, as you want to have maybe particles emanating from a 3D object. And so what we could do is take down the velocity to like 2 or something like that, really small. And then as we increase the particles per second, then we start to see that it's taking the shape of our 3D object. So there's no velocity, so then these particles are kind of gathering on the surface of that 3D object. But what I like to do, what I find myself doing all the time, if I'm looking for particles arranged around a 3D object, I usually would go to Form, because Form is basically built for that kind of thing. If I go to Effect, Trapcode, Form, boop. Form is a particle generator like Particular, except that the particles don't die. Like I scrub my timeline and nothing changes. These particles just exist permanently. They're there. And so then what I can do is change the shape of them. By default, they're in this like 3D grid. And I could change the grid to OBJ model and then change the OBJ settings and pick the OBJ. So now this kind of looks like Mir, but it's not, because this isn't actual like 3D geometry. These are particles arranged in the shape of a 3D object. And because they're not emitted, they just live there. This looks more like a 3D object. let me show you some cool stuff you can do with this just very quickly. And again, keep in mind Simon's little like spoiler thing for the future, that you're going to be able to bring in Cineware stuff into this, like moving 3D objects into this, which is going to be insane. It's going to be really incredible. Okay, I'm going to change the color of this, and I'm just going to make it like a blue, and then I'm going to change the blend mode to add, and there we go. We're starting to get a little something, little something. Then what I want to do is change the particle controls for the OBJ settings. So right now, the particles are going on the edges. Let's maybe change this to vertices. And then maybe this is too dense, so I can take down the particle density. By the way, a little secret trick a lot of people don't know about. You could actually go, like if I wanted to make this even more dense, I could actually take this above 100%. So if I want this to be even more dense and it's already 100%, you can, push it above, the limits. It's like the Spinal Tap thing. And the amp goes to 11 and all that stuff. Okay, so then what I could do here is I can go over to, let's say, for example, I'll go do some size random, do a little opacity random. Yeah, now it's starting to turn into something kind of cool looking, right? And this is the magic of using OBJs and Trapcode products, is you can stylize them and do really cool things. Also remember that this is an actual 3D object. So I could go back to Y rotation and move this around, and this is all moving in 3D space. It responds to lights and cameras. By the way, if you want to use this with lights, then you'd want to go into the shading section and then turn shading on, and then you could have the shading there.
Just whilst you're talking about lights there, Chad, we had an interesting question from Conlon about using particles with lights, and the specific question was, are you able to have particular or form particles emit light that would affect the entire 3D scene? And just because you mentioned it, I was in the middle of typing that the particles themselves don't emit light, but you can use lights as emitters, and that's sometimes interesting to actually light the particles with the movement of the emitters themselves. So not exactly using particles as light objects, but I thought that was an interesting question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, and that's another one of the themes that we'll get to throughout this week, is that, when you know these tools and know what they do, it just really unlocks a lot of creativity. Like I do a lot of like these kind of like webinar things for Red Giant, and it's amazing like how many like people who are so talented and so skilled have all these tools and they're not aware of the power at their fingertips. And so I want to show you like, the possibilities of what you can do. And I know I'm going kind of quick, but just I want to just kind of like crack through the glass of, the potential of what's going on here. Just really quickly, I'm going to go into the fractal field, which is a good way to like animate stuff. So there's a fractal field that's like kind of like auto animating by default in form. And if I adjust effect size, effect opacity, or displace to a non-zero number, it's going to automatically enable that stuff. So if I took effect size to like 5, effect opacity to like 20 or whatever, I could even take displace to like 1 or 2 or whatever. And then if I play this back, you can see this fractal field adjusting the size of the particles and the opacity of the particles and displacing them a little bit. And if I went into, I mean, I could fiddle with this all day, but if I went into like F scale, for example, I could increase the scale, like actually it's kind of backwards. It scales down the fractal noise map so that there's more like smaller details, which is really cool. And actually, just for the sake of time, I have like the cooking show one that's like already done. So here's this, and it's rotating around. I also have the light at the bottom, and I also have kind of like a little bit of like fractal field in there. I've also got some particular particles emanating from this or whatever, but you can really see that there's just a lot of really cool potential here. And you can see that like even like the things we added with the cloner are like particles that are being like fiddled with or whatever. So again, as you start to get familiar with the tools in Cinema 4D and in these like awesome Red Giant tools, start using them together to create some cool magic. Okay, let's move on. I want to talk about Mixamo here a little bit. Mixamo is this tool that you can upload a 3D model, and then it can rig it for you automatically, and then you could apply like one of these poses or whatever. And if you've ever done rigging yourself, it's just like this horrific torture of a punishment that that the CG gods have inflicted upon us mortals. It's just a horrible experience. And so when you upload a model to Mixamo, it will automatically rig it for you, which is incredible. But I find myself not using this as often as I would want to because I have so many technical issues with it. There's all these problems. Like 99% of the time when I upload a model, the materials don't come over well. And if the materials don't come over well into Mixamo, then they're not going to be there on the way out, and it's frustrating. So I decided for this webinar, I'm gonna figure it out. I'm gonna figure out what's going on, all the issues, and I'm gonna share some of those tips with you right now, as well as how to customize what's going on here. If I go over to Cinema 4D, I'm just gonna close this. This is just a horrible moment in my life. I'm just gonna close that chapter for good. I'm going to bring in this mercury.obj file. Notice there's a little material file. We're going to talk about that in a second. I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to uncheck invert transparency, and then here this guy goes. He's there. The theme of this week that we'll constantly be going into is like these astronauts out in space discovering this kind of glowing ball. It's kind of like a metaphor of Maxon acquiring a red giant. And so that's going to be a theme of what we're doing here. And so I want to give this astronaut some life. It's just a static mesh right now, so I want to put that bone structure in him and move him in certain ways. And so I'm going to do that with Mixamo. And what I can do here is go to File, Export, and then export an OBJ. That will export the material file as well. And what I was doing before is when I click upload character, I was uploading the OBJ here. And then I was so mad they would never bring the materials over. Well, here is the secret code, folks. This little material file is what you need in order for the OBJ to have materials on it. But what you do here is select both of these and zip them up. And then when you upload them to Mixamo, Mixamo will look in the zip folder for the materials, and it will have the materials. Now, the other way to do that, the other way to export this is to go to export and then to export an FBX, which is a really great file format. But the problem is that it never worked for me. And like Mixamo always gave me an error. And the reason why is because the file format is really important. The version of FBX that you're using is critical. So FBX is trying to sell itself, so it's got like a new version from 2019. Mixamo is a little behind the times, and so that doesn't understand this 2019 version. So I did a bunch of tests and realized that version 7.3 from 2013 is the code. That's the secret. If you export an FBX from Cinema 4D using version 7.3 2013, and I baked all the materials and embedded the textures in, then when you bring it over into Mixamo, then it will have the textures and everything working correctly. So then you can, click on any of these things and have, these. This is not working. Okay, that's fine. So what I can do is upload my character. Let's see how we're doing on time here. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and skip ahead. I've already done this. Oh wait, no, there we go. Okay, there we go.
I think it takes a while for it to upload to the cache on Mixamo.
Oh, okay. Bless your heart. Thank you. So there we go. It's got this cool. Some of these poses are really, really awesome. But I was looking diligently for a Cinema 4D metaphorical reaching out to a red giant particle ball animation preset in Mixamo, and they don't have one. So I guess Mixamo doesn't really care about the needs of their customers. So what I had to do was I had to improvise and try to find a piece of animation that worked. And I wanted to have this astronaut guy reaching out, and I couldn't find the reaching out preset that worked. So instead I found this part of a casting a spell, and there's a part where it looks like he's reaching up. I just want this little part. So what I did is I downloaded it, And when you download this, you probably want to download it with skin. If you don't download it with skin, it'll download the mesh. If you choose without skin, it'll just be the skeleton, just the bones of the object, and that doesn't typically help. So I downloaded that, and then I could bring this, oops, cancel this, and then I can open that up, and I have this thing here, and I'm just going to choose the default settings. And I want to show you how to tweak this. Yeah, and for some reason, when you get models back from Mixamo, they're insanely shiny. I'm, I'm not sure why that is, why you go through a buffer, apparently, when you go into Mixamo, but there you have it. So as I look out through this animation, as I play this back, I really want to create an elegant animation of this reaching out right here. And I don't really care about the mixing up a potion of whatever to throw it, whatever. So I just want to start my animation at frame 30. So I'm going to change the start time here by changing this right here, 30, and enter. So now this is the new 0. And then I want to go to about frame 50 or so right here. And so I want the animation to be this long, but I want to take this piece of it and stretch it out. And we can do that this way. I'm going to select the rig itself, and then I'm going to open up the dope sheet in Cinema 4D. And so then here it's like a keyframe, just like After Effects, we could see all of our keyframes. And orange means it's selected. So I can click to deselect, and then click and drag a marquee that includes all these keyframes, and then wait a second because it takes a minute to calculate the selection of all of those keyframes, at least it does on my system. And then I'm going to hit the delete key to delete that. Then I'm going to click and drag another marquee around the keyframes that I like here. Wait for it. And there you go. And then you get this bar at the top. And if we click and drag this bar at the right, it's almost like creating roving keyframes in After Effects, where it stretches out that animation. And now I can close this and go back to the beginning. And then now I have this elegant reaching out. That's exactly what I want. It's kind of like slow motion, elegant thing. And there we have it. So that's playing back in almost real time, if not real time. And that's what I wanted. I wanted the slow, elegant piece of that animation. So hopefully this helps you get a little bit more out of Mixamo, at least, that, you know, to get your materials in there using a zipped OBJ file with the material file, or using the FBX with the correct version number, the older version, and then also being able to just kind of look for pieces of animation so that you could customize this as needed here. Okay, let's hop into After Effects, look at a few more tricks here. By the way, let me show you this one little thing here. I have Mirror set up, and I'm going to go into OBJs, my OBJ settings. I got an OBJ model chosen, and I'm going to pick this guy, this astronaut. And this is an issue that happens a lot. We didn't notice it before with the garbage thing that I made in Cinema 4D, the little spike ball thing with the cloner, because I didn't have any textures on it. But if you do have complex textures, then this becomes a challenge, or seeming challenge. And what you have to do is go into the texture section. And then from the texture section, I could choose a texture layer, and I have the material here, all the UV unwrapped goodness from this character. And so then I could go to mirror and then choose from the texture drop down this texture, and there we have it. Our character is textured. And as with most 3D objects, especially like in mirror or whatever, you really want to be able to light this, because that makes a huge difference in the believability of what's going on with your 3D objects, as we'll see again momentarily.
Chad, we've had a quick question about mirror and what the difference is that between, say, form and particular, and what its limitations are. I mean, how does it refer to or compare with Element 3D? And also, whilst you're thinking about that, I was just wondering if you could point out how you can quickly make a wireframe out of an image, because we had that question on an earlier session.
Yes. So the purpose of mirror, it doesn't really compare to Element 3D, even though this feature kind of compares to Element 3D. But the purpose of mirror, I have this handy dandy chart that I don't have in this project, or else I would love to pull it up right now. But essentially, the way to think of these applications, these products, particular generates particles, and those particles emit. They have a lifespan, they have a birth time, they have a lifespan, and then they die out. Form is similar, and then it creates a bunch of particles, but they don't die. And so the things that you can do with those particles, because they don't die, is very unique. And then mirror is basically like a mesh tool. It creates a 3D mesh that you can play with. And if that sounds difficult to wrap your head around, then like join the club. It's a weird thing. It's an unusual tool. And so creating OBJs with mirror is almost like a weird hack of this interesting tool, but it already has all these 3D capabilities. Like if you're going to play with the reflectivity or the diffuse of it or whatever, reflections, like that's already been built in. So it kind of makes sense that you could bring in OBJ files, but really what it does is it creates a mesh that you can distort in weird ways. And again, that sounds ambiguous, and it kind of is. It's a really unique tool. All these, like form and mirror, are both really wacky things. And when we look at DAO this week, DAO is another one of those things that just kind of doesn't have an equal. So it is kind of more difficult to kind of wrap your head around. But I'm
You've got
going
a
to
great
zoom.
example of it that you show. I think you're going to show a bit later on about using a bump map to show off the mesh. But when
Yes.
I've been explaining Mir to people, I like it to the fact that it's you have the ability to switch things around or rotate and move the 3D element inside After Effects and be able to tweak it, not in the same way as you would in a modeler, say, but for those last minute tweaks and changes without having to go through the whole pipeline. That can be a useful thing, either in itself as a final delivery, or if you wanted to do a series of previs shots or set a number of different ideas up so you could more quickly iterate throughout a project.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me just show you this really quick. I have different shaders here in Mir. I could open up the shader, and by default it's set to smooth. I'm actually going to take this point light to less sexy, more utilitarian, whitish light there, um, and just to see what we're doing. But I could go down here to the shader, and it's set to smooth here. But I could also draw on it a wireframe, and you can see that it's using the texture. And maybe it'd be easier to see if we didn't have the texture on it. Maybe I could go to texture and just choose none. But yeah, so I could choose a wireframe for this mesh, and I could take down the line size if I wanted to. Or what I could do too, I'm just going to undo that. What I could do is do a second pass and add a wireframe on top of the textures. And you can't really see that you can't see it that well in this example, but the textures are still here. Yeah, you can see like his helmet underneath. So you can, it's kind of a cool way to like put a wireframe on something. And if you're not using an OBJ file, if you have just like geometry, then, putting a wireframe on it could create some really cool stylized looks and whatnot. Again, you can change the color. It's also ambient occlusion, a lot of really cool tools. We're low on time. Let me just show you one other example here about what Mir does and the power of Mir. So here's Mir in its native habitat. It's just like this mesh, and then I could go into like the fractal settings or whatever, and evolve this, and so we have this like cool satiny mesh. But at its default settings, both form and Mir aren't insanely inspiring. But again, I want to show you the power here. I'm going to take the frequency down to 0. And so we just basically have like a sheet, a 3D mesh sheet full of potential waiting to be fiddled with. And what I want to do is I want to create a texture. I want to create like a surface of an object, which I can do in Mir. And this is super, super cool. And this is another one of those things where I've been fiddling with this for a long time, and I haven't been able to get it right. And so I determined for this webinar, I'm going to figure it out, and I'm going to share it here. And I did. So I figured out some secrets that are really helpful. So basically, I went into Houdini, and I created this moon surface. It's not perfect, but it is what it is. It's just a black and white map. You could create this in Photoshop or, whatever else you wanted to as well. But I brought that over as an EXR file. It's just a solid image, but the fact that it's an EXR file is going to come in handy in just a minute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here I showed you earlier creating this fractal noise using the built-in fractal. But instead of using the built-in fractal, I want to use the EXR file I just showed you as an amplitude layer so that it gets its amplitude from that image. And I've heard this being done before, so then I could go here to this great moment where I finally bring in this EXR and nothing really happens. It's okay though, it needs a little bit more geometry. So I'm gonna increase the vertices. And as I increase the vertices, you could see that we're starting to get something. So then I could do 2048 by 2048, make it super, super dense. And it's looking better-ish. So if I maybe turn on my camera here and fiddled with this, okay, it's starting to get there. Maybe make a point light, take the pink out of the light, for goodness sakes. And then I'm gonna go ahead and click OK here. And I could move this around here, and it's not really doing what I want it to. This doesn't look incredible yet. So what I need to do here is change some more settings of mirror. So when I come down to mirror, now I'm going to change the shader. So the default is density, which creates this kind of like satiny mesh looking thing. So I'm going to take this to smooth. Okay, we're getting there. And then we also get this kind of like blending on top of itself. We get these little like highlights because it's in the add blend mode. So I'm going to take this to just normal, take the blend mode to just normal. And it's pretty noisy still. I'm going to change the light, move this around a little bit. A little bit here. And so we're getting something that's close, but it's just really not quite exactly what we need. And so what I want to do is fiddle with a couple more things here. And let's see, let me get a little bit, the lights are fiddly in After Effects. But okay, so I'm going to go to mirror and I'm going to go down to the rendering at the bottom. And I'm going to change the super sample from off to 4x. And I find that that's a necessary thing in order to get really beautiful stuff in mirror. And I think I might bump up the point light intensity a bit just for the sake of time so we could see what's going on. Because again, these lights are fiddly and it's like tough to get it in the right spot. Okay, good enough. Okay, so what happens is, and this is one of the issues that I've been running into for a long time, is that I know that there's all this detail from this Houdini map, but then there's like this like terracing. And what I did after hours of annoying tests and going back and forth, this is why the EXR comes in handy because the EXR is a 32-bit map. And we need all of that color detail, the gradient of the 32-bit color, in order to have a soft transition here. So I'm in 8 bits per channel mode, so I need to take this into 32 bits per channel, and then boom, there we have it. We have our beautiful texture here, moon texture, and then I could go into my like camera tool and I could move this around. It's an actual like 3D object. I have another example that I spent a little bit more time with here, and I know that this is ridiculous and not at all accurate, but I gave it like a shallow depth of field, which I know again is totally fake. But you never get to see shallow depth of field. I never get to see like this cool like like bokeh of stars and galaxies, and then planetary textures all out of focus. So I wanted to use a long lens and do some shallow depth of field, even though it's not anything that's in the real world. But as I move this around, you can see that this is a full 3D object. It's like we have this like 3D surface. And so this is kind of like mirror in a nutshell, where it's like really hard to describe, but it basically just takes a 3D mesh and allows you to do a bunch of stuff, whether that's create an OBJ file or like create a mesh with an OBJ file, or to take a texture map and map it. And you can also use fractal noise in After Effects. It doesn't have to be something that you import from somewhere else. You could use anything as a texture map, and then it creates these 3D objects, which is really cool. So that's mirror and everything else in a nutshell. And actually, you know what? Now that I'm looking at the time, I do have a couple minutes, so I'm going to go
Chad,
backwards.
just before you leave this scene, could you mind just
yes.
bringing up that depth of field setting, just so we can show where it's in the render settings inside mirror?
So yes, so if I go to mirror here, at the bottom, there's a rendering setting, the render mode, or the depth of field here. By default, it's set to off, and you just choose camera settings. Change it to camera
That's
settings.
great. That's what I want to point out to everyone, so you can inherit it from your After Effects camera.
Yeah, and then that's really great because then if like I wanted to like make an even more shallow depth of field, I can bump up the aperture to like 80 or whatever, and or maybe like 120 and create like this like super shrink ray look to it or
This is
whatever.
This is
But
great. The important thing about this is also because you're dealing with the camera, if you've got, say, particles on a layer above it, you also are then adding depth of field to the particles. So it's a nice way of solving more than one problem.
yeah, it makes it fit in your scene. You don't have to worry about like making the blur, the depth of field in mirror, because that would be tough. Then you have to go back and forth between like the real camera and the mirror camera. But this just uses the mirror camera, which is great. And actually, these like warm particles right here are Trapcode form, and then the other bokeh is coming from the thing in the background, the image in the background. So this is actually a combination of like how you'd want to use that, where it's actually blurring all the stuff.
Yep,
So
and the eagle-eyed of you will have noticed that Chad's still in the classic 3D renderer inside After Effects. So we are doing this on the GPU because Mira is GPU accelerated. It sits on the GPU automatically, so you don't have to do anything special. Whatever your machine, it will then pick this up. And I just mentioned that because we've had several questions about the workflow. When would you do something in Cinema? When would you do something in After Effects, and combinations of those? And I think that's a long question, but in this specific example is really quick to be able to tweak those things and then move around the angle and not have to re-render, but also not to spend a long time doing it because you're doing it using the inbuilt render inside Mir rather than having to turn on some external renderer. And just as a last comment on that, I've been using Mac and PCs and jumping in between them. And recently I've been doing a test between the Radeon cards on my recent MacBook Pro and also a Dell 7540 with an RTX 4000 card on it. And in all my tests for GPU, the RTX card is twice as fast as the top of the range one that I've got on the MacBook Pro. And they're similarly spec'd machines, a similar iChip on them. But so I just sort of throw that in because one of the other questions we get is how fast is this to render and update as you're rotating things around. So sorry for the long interruption, Chad, but just a couple of questions that we've had recently.
no worries, no worries. A couple of the things I was going to share just really quick. Again, just super quick. There is some problems I run into sometimes with mirror objects. So like, for example, I have, I can't use multiple 3D objects that talk to each other with mirror. Like you could have just one per, layer or whatever. They don't really respond to each other. So this is like something that I run into every once in a while where like I have this satellite dish and then I have the base of the satellite and I want the satellite to be in between here, but I can't get either. I could put the base on the top or I could put it on the bottom, but neither one of those works. And so one little hack that helps is in the visibility section, I can actually take down the far. This is meant to kind of do like clipping. So I could do clipping like this where I could kind of chop out that section and then I could duplicate the base and put it underneath. And so I actually have two versions of the base. So I have one on one side and one on the other. So again, this adjusts your Z space visibility as I drag this down. You can see that I'm kind of like cropping it in Z space. And so in that way, you can kind of sandwich objects to be kind of like in between other objects. Just a quick little tip. And then one other thing, there's an old product called Trapcode Horizon. And if we're playing around with Galaxy stuff, it can be helpful. What Horizon does is it takes a map or a gradient and maps it to a huge sphere. So then as you move around a 3D camera, it's a little bit more believable. So like if I had a 3D object here and then I move in space, you can see that my particles are moving in space, but then that background is like this flat card and it just feels not great. So what I can do is go to Horizon and change the image map layer to this background galaxy. And then now as I move this around, because it's mapped to a sphere, then I could kind of look all over the place. You look like up and down and go around there. And so there's there's that. So this is not really, you know, a 3D. This is not from Cinema 4D or anything like that. But as we're talking about 3D in After Effects with Red Giant products, it's good to be aware that this is kind of 3D in the sense that it's making a sphere and creating a world for you to inhabit, which can be pretty helpful. Just wrote the word space. Wasn't feeling super creative apparently when I when I made this example. But there you have it. Apparently that's the grand finale of this whole thing.
It works for Guardians of the Galaxy as well, so you're in good company.
Okay, good. Oh, good. So that's my whole spiel. So we could do like some more Q&A or whatever.
Well, the question from Landra, what are your comp settings at the moment, Chad?
My comp settings. That's a good question. Do you have like a specific question about comps? Like I have.
Yes. What is your comp settings? Yes.
Like.
But I imagine, Landra, you can give us more information about. I imagine it's the resolution that we're after.
So I have these like Retina monitors, and so in order to see things, like this is actually like HD. It's 1920 by 808. So I wanted to go for like the 240 aspect ratio, so that
That was the question. Yes, the aspect ratio for one. Excellent. Thank you.
yeah, I just want to be a little pretentious, just a little pretentious. So I made it 1920 by 808, and I'm at full resolution, by the way. So this is at everything's all full HD, well, anamorphic with the 240, but yeah.
I think that's a good way to show it. I know it's sometimes you can get away with showing half resolution on these things, and when you're showing off demos to update the screen quicker. But I like the fact that you've set this on full, because then we can see on an average machine, which is doing other tasks in the background, and you may or may not have a second monitor attached, kind of the real world performance when you are layering up these different stacks of composites.
Yeah, and I have a pretty good graphics card, but it's an NVIDIA graphics card, and this is like a 10-year-old Mac. So like they're always fighting, just like in real life. And so my NVIDIA, my machine is like super unstable and it doesn't give me the speed. So if, like this is the worst case scenario, what you're looking at right here. And like with stuff like this, I'm
pretty
at full
good.
resolution. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's pretty good performance you're getting off that. And I imagine that you're not going to upgrade to Catalina anytime soon.
No, I'm not going to do that.
No, because that would brick your NVIDIA card.
Yes.
But by the way, quick question on cards and so forth. If you do have an eGPU and you have a recent operating system for both Windows 10 and Mac OS, then you can accelerate your system. And there's a variety of tricks, but in most cases, the eGPU does speed things up. Certainly in After Effects from 2019 onwards, then it has the ability to use external graphics cards too. So one thing I've been experimenting with successfully is plugging in different eGPU units. And I've got a variety, the Blackmagic one off the Apple site and the Sonnet Puck. And also I've got a Sonnet chassis extension one, which allows you to put in custom cards. So it's something that could be something for consideration. But in terms of After Effects and Mia, it automatically picks up the graphics card, the GPU. You don't have to do any extra settings.
Oh, that's awesome. Man, I need to talk to you offline about the eGPU thing. I need to dip my toe into that world a lot.
I'm more than happy to bore you with all my various tests. A couple of
Yes.
things I quickly wanted to mention in the last couple of minutes. So Cotlin's had a great suggestion about particles emitting light. So we're definitely going to be adding those to the feature requests, and that's something that I encourage you to do. I'll just post my email here, simon@redgiant.com, and please feel free to reach out and contact me if you've got other questions or suggestions or feature requests like that, because that's fantastic to hear. And also, can I just switch the presenter over to me? Can I steal your screen for a second, Chad?
Take it. Yes.
Right. So let's switch over. One thing I really wanted to show is that Chad's been talking about form, for example, and some of the other Trapcode tools, but notice this, on the Red Giant tutorial page, a lot of the tutorials here are by Chad himself. Because let's say if you just go into tutorials, this is the way to search for it. Just type in what you need, really. So form, then you see a whole list of form tutorials. And I think it was 14 in the series that you did for the form, and you've done the ones for Tau as well, and also written the user guides. So it's really great to hear you talking about these things and integrating them and looking at them. So this is another resource that I think you'd find useful. And also, well, we'll add these into the links. There's a whole series of short little 20-second tutorials that I've uploaded onto my little channel. Don't worry, this isn't a plug. I don't earn any money off this. I've switched off all the ads. But I just wanted to give your attention to some of the things that Chad mentioned. For example, inside here, we've got a combination of two things. One is Trapcode Horizon, which Chad mentioned, which casts an HDR image inside a sphere, so you can orbit at any point, but also the fact that you can combine this with Mir. So you could have a model with a texture and a reflection map. In this case, it's the same reflection map as the HDRI image that is being projected on the inside of that sphere. And that means that you're able to mimic, if you like, a properly set up 3D scene. So it's, again, I know a studio that have used this for last minute switches and changes, and they actually set up a series of maps rather than getting them made in 3D, because they can just tweak them themselves, often in front of a client. So a lot of ways of doing similar related things. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that in many of these examples, we've got the project file that I've uploaded, so that you can then take that apart and just see how it's put together. So I just wanted to mention that as a resource. And also, just talk about just a quick little thing about the those webinars that got coming up that we listed out. So please feel free to sign up for future ones, so the ones tomorrow and Thursday. And a couple of questions about recordings that we've had. That yes, the recordings are available online. The same links in the PDFs act as the links to the recording. So if you register for something, you'll automatically get the recording. But if you missed it, just click on the time and the date, and then that will turn into the recording as well. So please feel free to do that. And all of this, all of the links will put into the email that you'll automatically get about an hour from now, which is the shortest amount of time that the webinar software allows us to send the email. But have a look out for that. That's linked to the recording and all these other tutorials. Fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate that it's not easy to carve out time, especially at these times. So thank you for making the time for us. And thank you, Darren, for answering those questions on the question pod as well. And thank you for the kind comments and the feedback. We really appreciate that. And it's always interesting for us to find out how you're actually using the software and what would be useful in terms of tools. So that's great. And a big thanks again to you, Chad, for letting us kind of be a fly on the wall of your creative process, because there's so many different ways of doing things, and it's so interesting to see how you would approach things, especially when you are wanting something creative in mind and you're wanting to use tools that perhaps are new to you. So it's lovely to see how you're investigating them, and also the troubleshooting that you found to fix things, like in that Mixamo example that you gave us. So thanks for that.
So thanks, man. It's my pleasure. Thanks for everybody for being here.
Fantastic. So we will have more info for you tomorrow and Thursday. If people want to find out more about you, Chad, where would they go?
That's a good question. I don't really have like a spot where I don't know if there's a large demand to be like, hey,
demand for Chad.
What's
yes,
he doing?
Exactly.
But I appreciate you being really generous and thinking that would be something of interest.
Well, you've got lots of stuff on the Red Giant site. I know you've done a lot of LinkedIn training, and wow, you've done a lot of other training. What's the name for the other host who does your courses?
I did a course for Creative Live, and then and most of my stuff is on LinkedIn Learning, and I've done some stuff on Udemy as well. But yeah,
Udemy, that's the one I was remembering. Yes, you got a great course on there. I remember watching.
Thank you.
Anyway, so we'll put some more of the links for this. But sorry to put you on the spot there, Chad.
That's fine.
Excellent, great. So thank you again, everyone. Stay healthy, still safe. Please feel free to come onto the other webinars, and feel free to reach out with questions and suggestions, just like you have. All right, take care and see you on the next one.
See ya.
Cheers then. Bye-bye.